If you look back over the last 2 to 3 years, Brazil has always had something of a stranglehold on the competitive circuit, be it the dynasty of W7M/Furia during 2023, or two separate teams from Brazil winning both a major and the Six Invitational in 2025. They've always been at the forefront when it comes to a region's dominance over the rest of the world, so to speak. But the year 2025 saw that very dominance waver a little bit, though not to the point where they are no longer collectively considered the best in the world. But do they still have enough potency to go back to back to back and win the region's third Six Invitational on the trot? Well, let's start this examination with the reigning world champions and SAO regional finals winners, Faze Clan, who I believe now holds the record for the longest standing 5-stack in Comp Siege history. I'm gonna have to do some sleuthing on that one, I think. Regardless, Faze has been a testament of Brazilian dominance and consistency for many, many years. Especially so since the roster of Cyber, Souls, Vidaking, Handy, and KDS have been together since just after SI 2023. And although 2025 was not as consistent, their best results are still nothing to scoff at. Chief among which, last year's Six Invitational. Second place in the group of death, lost to Space Station in the first round of the upper bracket, and on the verge of being eliminated by Team Liquid in the first round of the lower bracket. It was not a good start for them, but they pulled their socks up, got their hands dirty, and pulled off what should be the impossible. A full lower bracket run to win the 2025 Six Invitational, and the third team to do it in as many years, which in itself is an anomaly. And although Reload was not the start they wanted for the new season, Stage 1 of the SAL would show why this roster were the new world champions. Second place in the group stage, FaZe made it to the grand final through the upper bracket with relative ease, only to lose to long-standing rivals Furia in the grand final, which, in fairness to FaZe, these two now world championship rosters have been trading blows with each other even during 2023. So there's no real cause for concern there. And although they were eliminated from EWC in the group stage at the hands of Dark Zero and G2 respectively, no panic buttons were pressed there either. It's the first half of the season, a minimal amount of drop-off is to be expected. The second half of the year is what really matters. And yet again, Faze Clan did not disappoint, for the most part. Stage 2 of the SAL was probably where FaZe looked their weakest, with 4th place in the group stage and ultimately finished 3rd overall after losing to W7M in the lower bracket final. Munich is where they showed their mettle as world champions, even with a slight stumble in groups at the hands of M80. But even that failed to slow them down when they reached the playoffs, even getting revenge against M80 in the upper bracket. FaZe looked to deny Team Falcons their 4th attempt at lifting a trophy, but the EML squad would be the ones to rise up. They were the ones to deny Faze Clan, and M80 would break the deadlock between the two super squads, beating the reigning world champions in the lower bracket final. FaZe would round out the year with 1st in the SAL regional finals, despite having to go through the lower bracket after an early loss from W7M. Even with some rough results throughout 2025, FaZe showed time and again that same resilience and tenacity that won them the Six Invitational 12 months ago. Every time they fell down, they picked themselves back up and returned stronger than ever. It's been a core staple of their brand for years, and one of the reasons why we have seen them so dominant within Brazil for so long, as well as the fact that they're just that good. If you don't have Faze Clan within your top 3 or even top 5 for Paris, then clearly you have not been paying attention. There's a reason they're back to defend their title, and I think they can actually pull it off too. On the subject of world champions, Furia returns to the Six Invitational with a point to prove. The same roster that won every international tournament in 2023 and created their own dynasty has struggled to climb back up to the top of the mountain. Despite this, Furia has still remained relevant not only within the SAL but also internationally, maintaining their status as a regular for international tournaments. However, the results haven't really come their way this season, at least when it matters. Their World Championship defense this time last year was probably the biggest sign that the rest of the world was catching up to them at a rapid pace. Furia would come out on top of the group of death during SI in Boston, but not without an interesting result. A 0-2 loss at the hands of Kagosaka on day 1. Full Heatbox, Herds, JV92, KZ, and Nade must have felt incensed at this, because they would not drop another map on their way to the upper bracket final against BDS. They'd even 7-0'd Shopify Rebellion during the group stage. However, upon making the main stage of Boston, Furia would ultimately bow out of the Six Invitational in third place. Their crown surrendered and handed to a new champion. Despite this, Furia would stick with their tried and true system ahead of Reload and Stage 1 of the South America League. And it was here that they would return to their winning ways. Not only would they redeem themselves against Kaga Osaka in the grand final of Reload, they would also take the top step of the podium for Stage 1 after a slow start to the group stage. At the same time, they had also qualified for EWC as the first seed out of the South America League. And despite an upper bracket loss to Oxygen in the group stage, Furia would bounce back and make it into the playoffs from the lower bracket with wins over OCE Squad Enterprise and their South American compatriots in W7M. The playoffs didn't really go as planned, as a loss to G2 in the semifinals forced them to play in the third place match against Space Station, who they actually beat rather soundly. Furia performed way better in Stage 2 of the SAL than they did in Stage 1. Second place in groups, losing out to NIP of all teams on round count, and not dropping a series on their way to a second SAL stage win for the 2025 season. Fun fact, they were only one of 2 teams to perform such a feat across the entire R6 circuit for 2025. However, despite Furia's domestic dominance and their qualification to the Munich Major being quite easy, all things considered, this is where things start to get shaky for the Panthers. For one thing, they would immediately fall to the 0-2 pool after an overtime loss to D+, and a 7-2 thrashing to Shopify Rebellion. They would only just avoid utter embarrassment thanks to 3 straight wins against Kaga Osaka, a surprisingly spirited Enterprise who pushed them to map 3 in their match, and W7M. For a brief moment, Furia were at severe risk of being eliminated from a major in dead last. And although they just managed to scrape into the playoffs by the skin of their teeth, they would be forced to start from the lower bracket. And to rub salt in the wounds, they only played the one match in front of a crowd, as Furia were eliminated from Munich at the hands of Team Secret. And while they would bounce back and push Faze Clan to map 3 of the SAL Regional Finals Grand Final, they would ultimately fall short with a 2-1 loss. And this kind of begs the question, are the best days of this iteration of Furia long gone? Is it possibly time for a refresh? I'm inclined to think no, at least not yet. But at the risk of hundreds of angry Brazilian fans spamming my DMs, you can see the evidence beginning to stack up. Teams are beginning to figure these guys out. They are no longer the indomitable force we saw back in 2023, and the rest of the world has begun to catch up at a rate of knots. That said, however, that does not mean that they're completely washed just yet. They're still very good Brazilian Siege players, and that should always be taken into account. Fail to take Furia seriously at your own peril. They are still hungry for another world championship. Now, Faze Clan and Furia I have some degree of confidence in for one reason or another. The rest of the Brazilian teams that qualified, however, I'm less confident. Not because they didn't earn their place in Paris, but rather the strength and results of each of the teams during the season is rather lacking compared to the first 2 squads. Let's start with, technically, the newest organization to the R6 circuit, Fluxo W7M. Okay, let me explain. Back when the new R6 share program was announced and most of the partner teams were revealed, Brazilian organization Fluxo were among the teams announced. However, W7M acquired Fluxo shortly before Boston, acquiring the R6 share spot in the process. And just last month, it was announced that the 2 organizations would merge, with W7M absorbing Fluxo into their operations. Think of it like what Cloud9 did for Beast Coast for Stage 2 of the NAL last year, before Cloud9 pulled the plug about 4 months later. But W7M's 2025 campaign would begin after a less than successful run in Boston, being eliminated in straight sets after finishing second in their group behind Virtus Pro. Things went from bad to worse, as Dash was benched shortly after SI wrapped up, and eventually left the organization to join Wildcard for the North America League. But in his place, the Bulls would secure the services of one of the most iconic entry fraggers in Brazil, Palu, who had recently left Team Liquid after their disastrous SI campaign came to an end, and subsequently split up the legendary duo he had with Nesk. We'll get to that in a second. And at first blush, it seemed to work, with W7M reaching the semi-finals of Reload before eventually losing to Furia. But from here on out, things would get a little inconsistent. Stage 1 is a good example of this, with first in the group ahead of Faze Clan, but they would immediately fall to the lower bracket with a loss to Furia. And although they would qualify to EWC with a win over Black Dragons, they would barely put up a fight against NIP to finish in 4th overall. Speaking of their EWC campaign, they actually did have a solid start to their group with a 7-1 win over SSG, but W7M would be on the receiving end of a 7-2 beating at the hands of Team Secret before being eliminated from EWC by Furia, 2-0. Stage 2 actually began well enough, with 3rd in the group stage, and even making it to the grand final after being sent down to the lower bracket by Furia, again, only to lose in the grand final 2-1 to Furia, again. Talk about gatekeeping. But if you thought stage 2 of the SAO was pretty good for W7M, wait until you get to Munich, because this is where most of my concern comes from. Reaching the 2-0 bracket thanks to wins over both NIP and Enterprise, they would essentially bomb out of the group stage with 3 straight 2-0 losses to Team Falcons, Wildcard, and Furia. Yet again. And the only close match they had was against Wildcard. W7M had 3 chances to make the main stage of the major, and they failed 3 times. Most teams don't get multiple chances to promote themselves out of groups. And the worst part? They practically handed their opponents the results they needed. W7M would ultimately finish the year with 3rd of the regional finals, with a 2-7 loss to Faze Clan in the lower bracket final, before the merger with Fluxo took full effect. I'm kind of annoyed with Fluxo W7M right now. They were major winners in 2024, and they have one of the best entry fraggers in Palu to bolster their firepower. And now they're struggling to maintain their relevance within the SAO as a legitimate top team. Even if we took Furia gatekeeping them out of the equation, the fact that they repeatedly find themselves in a position where they're facing elimination in the group stage of an international LAN tournament, when they should realistically be making the playoff bracket, it boggles the mind to an unbelievable degree. It shouldn't happen. The Munich major was probably their most disappointing result, if I'm being honest. Because of that, it makes me wonder if they'll actually make it out of their group in Paris. On paper, this should not be much of an issue. I say that knowing that both Enterprise and Oxygen are in their group, but don't be too shocked if they bottle it somehow. And Ninjas and Pyjamas are in a similar situation, but ironically are in a slightly better position. After losing longtime player Psycho to greener pastures, or in this case purple, NIP would go for a long time without finding their 5th player. But seeing as they weren't going to SI, it was partly an issue for them. Eventually, they would find their man in the returning Wizard, who had a brief stint on Los during the second half of 2024. So the 2025 NIP roster consisted of Pino, STK, Fancy, Hates, and Wizard. The beginning of their campaign actually didn't start off too badly, with 3rd place in groups behind W7M and Faze Clan. Following a 2-0 win over Black Dragons in the first round of the uppers, the Ninjas would fall to the lower bracket at the hands of Faze Clan. Despite a spirited effort from Team Liquid, NIP would beat the Blue Cavalry 2-1 and qualify for EWC, and even did one better by putting W7M's run to bed. Things fell short against Furia in the lower bracket final, but this seemed to be a recurring theme for Furia. But they wouldn't have to worry about that for EWC, as they would be the only Brazilian squad to qualify to the playoffs through the upper bracket of their group. But they would not progress any further than the quarterfinals after losing to G2. Stage 2 threw up an interesting twist, as NIP would take top spot at the end of the group stage, only losing to Furia, which is to be expected. But despite the advantage of a first round bye, the Ninjas would still be sent down to the lower bracket by Faze Clan. Even though Lowe's pushed them to map 3 and all 3 maps having to go to overtime, NIP held firm and punched their tickets to Munich by the skin of their balls. And they would repeat the same trick in Munich. Falling to the 0-2 pool alongside Furia, NIP would claw their way into the playoff bracket by beating SSG, Rebellion, and BDS. But they would fall to the surprise packet of Wildcard in the lower bracket, their only match in playoffs, I might add. and their 2025 would end with a whimper with a 5th place finish at the SAL Regional Finals, with back-to-back losses against Furia and Team Liquid. This season, NIP has been consistently punching above its weight, and you know what? They're keeping pace more often than not. Making the playoffs of both EWC and the Munich Major should not be ignored. That shows some pretty damn good consistency. But that in itself is a bit of a double-edged sword. And here's why. Both the EWC and the Major have wildly different formats for the group stage and the playoff bracket. And in any case, SI is a marathon, not a sprint. And I'm worried that Ninjas in Pyjamas might not have enough in the tank for a full ride of the hammer. But if nothing else, they'll at least make their group a hell of a lot more interesting. But if you want to talk interesting, look no further than the team that qualified to the 6th Invitational via the Last Chance qualifier. Black Dragons. The team that did not compete at the EWC, the Munich Major, or the South American League Regional Finals somehow managed to book their place in Paris by denying a legend one last chance to play the biggest tournament of the year. Nesk, if you're somehow watching this, congratulations on your long and storied career, and I'm sorry you weren't able to go to SI one last time. Best of luck in your future endeavors. But if Black Dragons were looking to make a push for the hammer themselves, then they have the mother of all mountains to climb. Rare, Ask, Miracle, Mr. Outlaw, and Swag started their SAL season, shall we say, badly. Only just managing to scrap into the playoff bracket of Stage 1 ahead of Loud on round difference. But they would bomb out in straight sets with losses to Ninjas in Pyjamas and W7M. They would even lose the 5th place match against Team Liquid. BD did not win a single map in any of those games, and they got 7-0'd twice. And Stage 2? That was even worse, as they would not even make the playoffs after they finished 9th. Not good enough. And they would miss out on regional finals because of their poor Stage 2 result. And yet somehow, Black Dragons would overcome all challenges in the Last Chance qualifier bracket and snag the last SAL spot for the 6th Invitational by overcoming Loud, Elevate's Academy roster, and Team Liquid. All from the upper bracket, no less. Where the hell was this during the regular season? Despite the form they found themselves in at just the right time, do not expect any miracles to come from Black Dragons in Paris. And here's my first hot take of 2026. I think Black Dragons might actually be the weakest team attending the 6th Invitational in 2026. And I'm saying this knowing that we have an EU Tier 2 squad that's also competing as well. And we still have to talk about the Asia Pacific leagues as well. I just don't think they have the ceiling to compete with the rest of the competition. If they somehow make it out of that group, then that is completely and utterly insane. But I really don't think that's going to happen. If you look at each of the SAL squads that qualified to 6th Invitational by their own merits, then you have some fairly strong squads in their own right. But the problems begin when you compare them to the rest of the competition. I think Faze and Furia can make a deep run and maybe challenge for their second respective hammers. Fluxo W7M feels a bit inconsistent, but the fact that it's all BO3s might be their saving grace. Ninjas in Pyjamas have the potential to play spoiler in their group and throw out an interesting surprise. And BD, I think that's going to get squished, plain and simple. Brazil's dominance in competitive siege over the last couple of years is beginning to fall away. But that's only because the rest of the leagues are finally beginning to catch up. That's it for the South American League's delegation to SI for 2026. Do you think Brazil has a chance of lifting the hammer again for the 3rd time in a row? Let me know in the comments below, and while you're at it, feel free to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you're alerted when new videos drop. The final stop in our breakdown tour is the APL, and this one might get a little controversial. Until next time, operators, this is your resident Silverwolf, signing off.